Love your neighbor. Hi, I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist. Today's episode, we look at this amazing thing that happens in competitive free markets where both parties get richer at the same time. And we start with this amazing scripture from Matthew 22, starting with verse 36, where it says, "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law?" And in verse 37, Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." Thus, our title today, Love Your Neighbor, but you also love yourself. We had one of the most enjoyable experiences I have in my economics class at Dallas Baptist University this week when we were talking about consumer surplus and producer surplus. So I asked them how much the students might pay for a certain set of pictures to be sent to them. It's called Groovebook, and it's extremely cheap, and that's why I chose it to kind of set them up. So in groups they say, "Oh, I think that's worth $25. Some said 20, some said 15, some said 10. The real price is $4. And so I write on the board, okay, this group said they'd pay 25. It's called willingness to pay in economics. You actually pay 4. Your consumer surplus is 21. This group said they'd pay 10. The actual price is 4. Their consumer surplus is 6. In a competitive environment, this happens every time you buy something. In a competitive environment. Keep your seatbelt on. We're going to talk about when it doesn't happen in about 5 minutes. But for now, let's assume that every time you're in a Walmart or a Target or a Dollar General and you hear that beep, you say somebody just got richer. Okay, I know it sounds like the angel Clarence in It's a Wonderful Life saying, every time a bell rings, an angel gets its wings. All right, you think of that. Every time you're in Walmart and you hear that beep, you say somebody just got richer by buying something from Walmart. Yes, they did, if it's a free competitive market. Look, I did the exercise. I give a student $1. I'm standing there with a box of tissues. I say, "Do you want the tissues for $1? The student says, "Yes." She gives me the $1. I give her the tissues. Who got richer? In a free competitive environment, both got richer. Now, she lost money, but she gained goods. So in economics, she got richer. Think about it. Why would anybody make a decision in a competitive environment to make yourself poorer? That would never happen. And then I set them up by saying, okay, who thinks tuition at Dallas Baptist University is too expensive? About 8 of them raise their hands. And I say, rather interestingly, why are you here? Think about it. Why would you stand at the counter to buy DBU tuition that makes you poorer? Especially my students, they're good students. They could go to over 1,000 colleges. It's a competitive environment. They chose Dallas Baptist University, just like my student who stood at the counter and said, "I'd rather have the tissues than the $1. Students stand at the counter at universities across the fruited plain and say, "I'd rather have the tuition than the money." I'm making this willing exchange. Every time you buy something, you get richer. And by the way, don't tell my wife that. But it's true in economics. In a competitive environment, everybody gets richer, and that's called consumer surplus. And this is requiring competition, by the way. Again, I'm 2 minutes away from explaining that. And I talk about competition in episode 7 if you're more interested in that. Well, now here's producer surplus. This is easy. I mean, you don't have to get out of bed and be in my class at 8 o'clock in economics to know that Walmart perhaps paid 40 cents for the tissues and they're selling them for $1. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows Walmart gets richer because they sell products for a higher price than they buy them. But what people who've not had economics don't understand is that first part, that when you buy something, you get richer too, because you lose the money, but you gain the goods. See, in a free competitive market, that's what happens. And so we established these two ideas of consumer surplus, which means the consumer gets richer, producer surplus, the supplier gets richer, Walmart in my little example here, both get richer. And I point at the diagram and say, if you love your neighbor, you'll supply consumer surplus. You'll make an exchange in which they get richer. See, in a competitive environment, you don't have to make that choice. You are forced to. Because if they don't like your prices at Walmart, they'll go to Target or Dollar General, right? And so this is the value of competition, which I explain in episode 7. And so back to the diagram. If you love your neighbor, you will produce consumer surplus for them. If you love yourself, you will have producer surplus. Walmart gets richer, the customer gets richer, both parties get richer. I mean, this idea of love of your neighbor actually comes from the Scotsman Adam Smith, who in 1776 wrote the landmark book in economics called An Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith was a deist. He doesn't believe the same way most of us do, but that's all right. And he said that the market is not driven by greed. It's driven by self-love. Well, this is exactly what Jesus said in Matthew 22:39. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. If you love both, you will appreciate a competitive environment where both parties get richer. Now the part I promised you. When do producers get richer at the expense of consumers? This is called market failure, and mostly it's due to market power. There's something in my other course we teach, strategic management, and it's called the rule of three. Many industries are controlled by three competitors. And so there's three major soft drinks in America. Coke, Pepsi, and Dr. Pepper control a high percentage of the soft drinks that get sold. Credit cards, there's only three. MasterCard, Visa, and Federal Express. They control a high percentage of the industry. The greeting card industry is controlled by almost two. It's almost a duopoly. It's Carlton and American Greeting Cards and Hallmark. That's three. Many, many industries. I could go on and on. The beer industry is the clearest. Budweiser, Coors, and Miller's control a high percentage. I used to work in the tennis ball industry. I used to work for Penn. Penn and Wilson control over 90% of the industry. These examples go on and on. That's called market failure. And in those cases, there is more producer surplus than there is consumer surplus. And you've seen the airlines concentrate during your lifetime. When U.S. Air bought American Airlines, Northwest and Delta went together, United and Continental went together. That reduced the rivalry. And so between those three and Southwest Airlines, last I looked, they control about 65% of the airline market. When that happens, they can raise prices and producers get richer while consumers get poorer. Now, specifically in airlines, it doesn't seem to me as though it has happened because airline fares are really cheap, it seems to me. But you can see the point, right? So this goes back to our Christian worldview. Those producers are fallen. They want to reduce the number of suppliers. In economics, this means it moves the supply curve left, which raises the prices. But most of the things we buy are in a relatively competitive environment, particularly necessities. One of the data points I use is since 1960. I don't know why the year is 60, it just happens to be. In 1960, Americans spent 14% of their disposable income on food. It is now 6%. Do you realize that your friends who work in the food industry have competed so much that you now spend half of what you spent in 1960 for food, which is a necessity? I mean, competition is the greatest thing going because both parties get richer. You love your neighbor as you love yourself. Yeah. Adam Smith said, each man seeking his own self-interest provides for the interest of all. Well, first, that doesn't quite make sense to you when you start to study economics. How can that be? How can two fallen people both come out of the transaction ahead? I'm going to repeat my goofy little statement. Every time you hear that beep in a retail setting, both parties got richer if there's enough competition, and in most things in America there is. So Milton Friedman, let's see what he had to say. He said most economic myths grow out of the zero-sum fallacy. And a lot of people do believe this. They think that Walmart does get richer as you get poorer. That is not true. In a competitive environment, both parties get richer. Milton Friedman was an atheist, but I agree with his statement. Most economic myths grow out of a zero-sum fallacy. I'm a Christian. He's an atheist. So as a Christian, I say most economic myths grow out of a misunderstanding of the fallen nature. But that's not our subject today. Okay, so Adam Smith considered this invisible hand of the market, which transcended human limitations and expressed as an expression of God's benevolent and providential governance of human society. I'm reading from Money, Greed, and God by Jay Richards here, by the way. I should have identified that. I'm halfway through this quote. Back to Richards. Since this market created a more harmonious order than we would otherwise expect. Money, Greed, and God by J. Richards. Look, in a free market capitalist society, you are free to serve your neighbor. In a socialist economy, you are not. That's why Christians favor the free market, because we like the freedom to serve our neighbors. In a socialist environment where the government owns the means of production and distribution, you're not free to love your neighbor. This is one of my favorite quotes, and I'm going back to J. Richards again. Money, Greed, and God. Here's a quote. The market is, as Friedrich Hayek said, quote, probably the most complex structure in the universe. That's the end of the Hayek quote. Now I'm going back to Money, Greed, and God by J. Richards again. Here he says, it deserves our admiration. The market deserves our admiration. And yet very few Christian critics have fully understood it. Fewer still have thought of it as a stunning example of God's providence over a fallen world. It is just what we might expect of a God, who even in a fallen world can still work all things together for good. Money, Greed, and God by J. Richards. Love your neighbor and love yourself. That's what the free market does. I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist, where our slogan is, fear God, tell the truth, earn a profit. See you next time.